Alrighty, it's time to start a new book series, and for this one, I think it's time we had a look at something by Dr. William Lane Craig. Hey there, folks. Bert from the Barely Bearable Atheist here, starting a new series covering the book On Guard by William Lane Craig. Published in 2010 by David C. Cook, this book has as its subtitle, Defending Your Faith with Reason and Precision. And okay, it's 15 years old at this point, but I figure that if Christians ain't got their story straight in 2010 years, another 15 ain't likely to make a difference. I reckon if you's at all familiar with atheist and skeptical YouTube channels, you'll have heard of William Lane Craig before, especially after he appeared in a video recommending that Christians lower their standards in order to more easily believe in the gospel. And when some of the atheist channels got a hold of it and started calling him Low Bar Bill, he actually doubled down. So apparently, modern-day Bill Craig ain't all that confident in Christianity's ability to live up to higher standards of evidence. But none of this had happened as of the time this book was written, so it might be interesting to look at an earlier Bill Craig and see if perhaps during his younger days he might have had a bit more confidence in Christianity. Maybe in the optimism of youth, he'll claim that Christianity has convincing evidence in its favor and maybe even conclusive proof. You think? Well, we'll see. Chapter 1 starts off prosaically enough with a definition of what apologetics is. Quote, apologetics is not the art of telling somebody you're sorry that you're a Christian. Rather, apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a defense, as in a court of law. Christian apologetics involves making a case for the truth of the Christian faith. End quote. And now you know where Apologia gets the name of his channel from, in case you didn't know before, but I digress. So Dr. Craig is starting out at a very elementary level, explaining to believers that apologetics don't mean apologizing. And that tells us something about who his target audience is. He ain't talking to theologians or scholars or even skeptics who's looked into the evidence for Christianity and found it wanting. He's talking to just folks, ordinary believers sitting in a pew listening to sermons. Folks, in other words, who's inclined to take his word for things just because he says so, and of course because they want to believe that what he's saying is true. He goes on to say that the Bible commands Christians to learn apologetics. Quote, just as the contestants in a fencing match have learned both to parry each attack as well as to go on the offensive themselves, so we must always be on guard. 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to make a defense, apologia, to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Author's translation, end quote. And there's the title of the book explained for us, as well as Craig's theme. This is going to be a book about both deflecting attacks and going on the offensive. So it does sound like younger Bill Craig had more confidence in the evidence for Christianity than he does today. I will say this, though, for younger Bill Craig, he's a good writer. In our last book series, Greg Kokel used the TV detective Lieutenant Columbo as a metaphor for Christians keeping their cool and presenting the gospel in an inoffensive manner, which is okay but not terribly inspired. Compare that with younger Bill Craig's presentation. Quote, apologetics is also not the art of making somebody else sorry that you're a Christian. We can present a defense of the Christian faith without becoming defensive. We can present arguments for Christianity without becoming argumentative. End quote. Short, pointed, and quotable. He don't need to recreate the entire character and mood of a 1970s TV show to create a metaphor. He gets his point across by juxtaposing defense with defensive and arguments with argumentative. In one paragraph, he's conveyed the attitude that Christians ought to have with at least as much clarity as Greg Koukl achieved in an entire chapter. So, yeah, Bill Craig is a smart feller, and I think that makes it even more telling that an older, more experienced Bill Craig has acknowledged that you ought to lower your standards of evidence if you want to believe in Jesus. Anyway, he goes on to say that the best way to keep your cool is to know your stuff. Quote, if you have good reasons for what you believe and know the answers to the unbelievers' questions or objections, there's just no reason to get hot under the collar. End quote. And this presupposes, of course, that the believer has good reasons for what they believe and that the unbeliever's questions and objections has good answers. Because if that ain't the case, it's going to be a lot harder for believers to keep their cool. The next section of Chapter 1 tackles the question of whether apologetics is even biblical. Don't the Bible say that it's the Holy Spirit that convinces folks? And here's Dr. Craig's answer. Quote, I think that the example of Jesus and the apostles affirms the value of apologetics. Jesus appealed to miracles and to fulfilled prophecy to prove that his claims were true. End quote. And here's where things get a little tricky. It's true that the gospel writers was doing apologetics when they wrote the stories about Jesus supposedly appealing to miracles and fulfilling prophecies. But the gospel writers ain't Jesus. When Dr. Craig appeals to what Jesus said or did, he's really appealing to other apologists. They ain't writing down stories about Jesus in order to preserve an impartial history of what actually happened. They's writing down stuff to try and convert folks. As it says in John 20:31, quote, these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, end quote. And that's important. That's something we should never, ever, ever forget. This ain't necessarily anything that Jesus ever said or did. This is stuff that's being attributed to Jesus by men who want us to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Because if we believe what they tell us about Jesus being the supreme authority, they can piggyback on that authority to claim that they also has the authority to tell us what to do and how we should live, being as how they supposedly speaking on his behalf. And that's what Dr. Craig is doing right here. He's appealing to Jesus as an authority who justifies what Dr. Craig is teaching about apologetics. But the basis of his appeal ain't stuff that Jesus himself necessarily said or did. He's actually basing his appeal on the apologists who wrote the Gospels. Jesus himself didn't write any of the books that were later incorporated into the Bible. Dr. Craig tries to reconcile the work of apologetics with the supposed work of the Holy Spirit by saying that they're both important. Quote, so it's clear that both Jesus and the apostles were not afraid to give evidence for the truth of what they proclaimed. This doesn't mean that they didn't trust the Holy Spirit to bring people to God. Rather, they trusted the Holy Spirit to use their arguments and evidence to bring people to God. End quote. And this is number 7 on my list of top 10 signs of an imaginary God. Humans does the work and then gives God the credit for whatever they manages to accomplish. What Dr. Craig fails to acknowledge here is that if real people don't do the evangelism, ain't no Holy Spirit going to make no converts. It's up to human effort to make quote-unquote God's work happen so that they can give him the credit for it. Which is lucky for Dr. Craig, because if the Holy Spirit did bring folks to faith in Jesus without apologetics, then Dr. Craig would be out of a job, and so would every other apologist and evangelist. Sure, millions more souls would be saved if God cut out the middleman and went straight to folks directly so they could have a solid basis for their faith. But that ain't as important to God as making sure that folks like Dr. Craig can earn a living by trying to make up for God's failure to show up objectively in the real world. Am I a snarky bear? I might just be a snarky bear. Anyways, from here, Dr. Craig moves on to the topic of, quote, Why is apologetics important? End quote. And you might think that the number one reason would be to save the souls that Jesus died for, but you'd be wrong. Quote, number one, shaping culture. We've all heard of the so-called culture war going on in American society. A tremendous struggle for the soul of America is raging right now. End quote. And by struggle for the soul of America, he of course means the struggle to preserve Christian supremacy in a world where theistic beliefs is increasingly irrelevant to real-world concerns. Christian patriarchy, bigotry, and xenophobia has had an increasingly negative impact on the religion's reputation, and the response of conservative Christians has been to double down on the patriarchy, bigotry, and xenophobia. And that only makes the downward spiral worse. Dr. Craig is writing this back in 2010, so at the time of his writing, he has no idea how vulnerable this culture war rhetoric is going to make conservative Christians to political manipulation by depraved demagogues like Donald Trump. He's laboring under the misapprehension that uniting religion and politics is going to somehow produce a heaven on earth. And in his mind, that's the number one goal of apologetics. When the whole thing starts to stink and rot like it's doing today, he ain't even going to have the benefit of hindsight, because if he admits that the whole thing was a huge mistake, it's going to undercut his apologetics because of the way he's linking the two right here. But back in 2010, he's still gung-ho for the culture wars, and he cranks the Christian persecution complex up to 11. He points an accusatory finger at the so-called new atheists and declares that they want to, quote, exterminate religious belief completely, end quote. And never mind that what he's actually advocating is a reasoned discourse and a thoughtful consideration of the evidence. He includes a cartoon showing Baptists in an enclosure at a zoo being presented as an exhibit for tourists to gawk at, and says that this represents, quote, the perception of Christians by the cultural elite in American society today, end quote. He says that belief in Jesus Christ is, quote, politically incorrect, end quote, and declares that the so-called cultural elite see Christians as dangerous people who should not be allowed to occupy positions of influence in society. And at this point, 15 years later, I think it's fair to ask, did any of his dystopian predictions come true? Did the so-called cultural elite pass any legislation outlawing religious belief entirely? Did any Christians get put into zoos? Has Christians been eliminated from all positions of influence in society? Of course not. This is baseless, hysterical fear-mongering designed to inflame folks' emotions and make them upset that other points of view is getting equal consideration in a secular society. Nobody's discriminating against folks who has earned the right to exercise leadership in science and education and politics and whatnot. If they happens to be Christians, that's fine, but the important point is that they's actually done the work and demonstrated that they deserves to be in positions of influence, and that they ain't just there because they've paid lip service to the right deity. That's the kind of meritocracy that so-called woke ideology is advocating, but that's Christian equality, not Christian supremacy, and Dr. Craig can't be having with that. And 15 years later, we're starting to see the fruits of the seeds that Dr. Craig was sowing in 2010. We see conservative Christians elevating Trump as some kind of latter-day Messiah. We see positions of influence and power being given to folks with no relevant qualifications for the offices they've been appointed to. We see the dismantling of legal protections for individual liberty and fundamental human rights, all with the enthusiastic support of conservative Christians. And by the time these believers wake up and realize they've been lied to, we're going to be deep in a hole that ain't going to be easy to dig our way out of. And all of this is what Dr. Craig calls the number one reason why apologetics is important. Jesus is going to come back to his tomb just so he can roll over in it. But there's more. Dr. Craig goes on to explain exactly why culture wars is important to Christianity in general. Quote, why are these considerations of culture important? Why not just preach the gospel to a dark and dying world? A person who has been raised in a culture that is sympathetic to the Christian faith will be open to the gospel in a way that a person brought up in a secular culture will not. End quote. In other words, everything he said before about the Holy Spirit bringing folks to Jesus is a lie. Ain't no Holy Spirit working directly and supernaturally on folks' hearts to bring them to Jesus. They has to be culturally conditioned first, which is exactly what we'd expect if in Christianity is a myth and there ain't no Holy Spirit, period. And thing is, this kind of cultural conditioning does work, and it don't need no actual God to make it work. Christian supremacists has been able to infuse American culture and especially American education with constant pro-Christian assumptions and messaging, and this has perpetuated the supremacy of the Christian religion in American culture. But they's made such a mess of things that they's beginning to lose some of that influence, and they don't like it. As Dr. Craig warns us, quote, if America's slide into secularism continues, then what awaits us tomorrow is already evident today in Europe. Western Europe has become so secularized that it's hard for the gospel even to get a fair hearing. End quote. And by no fair hearing, of course, he means that when the evangelist talks to folks don't automatically assume that they's telling the truth and or that they's doing a good thing by preaching. The problem that Dr. Craig is glossing over here is the fact that God ain't doing nothing to make himself at all relevant in the modern world, which is what we'd expect if he's just a myth. Western Europeans and a growing number of Americans has realized that God has the same relevance to modern society as Luke Skywalker or the Incredible Hulk or any other fictional character. And that's because God ain't doing nothing to make himself relevant. This ain't a man problem. This is a God problem. Using political shenanigans to take over a society so you can use it to indoctrinate folks is a cover-up for the very real problem of God's lack of involvement. Simply put, he don't act like he's a real God, and that leaves us ordinary folks without any good reason to believe that he's anything more than a myth. And that's doubly a problem for Dr. Craig because not only does it impede the gospel, but he can't even admit that that's the problem in the first place. So he has to throw up all this smokescreen about secular culture being quote-unquote biased against the gospel, when the real problem is that the Holy Spirit don't do what Dr. Craig claims he does. He's acting like a myth and leaving it to Dr. Craig to make up the difference with his culture war stuff. Dr. Craig straight up says it's up to human folks to change society in a way that stacks the deck in favor of Christian evangelism. Quote, if the gospel is to be heard as an intellectually viable option for thinking men and women today, then it's vital that we as Christians try to shape American culture in such a way that Christian belief cannot be dismissed as mere superstition. End quote. And that's exactly false. If in the gospel were an intellectually viable option for thinking men and women today, you wouldn't need to resort to psychological manipulation and conditioning in order to manufacture minds that's predisposed to believe in your preaching. A real God would behave in such a way that Christian belief would not be dismissed as mere superstition. He wouldn't go to all the trouble to make himself into a mortal earthly human and spend years walking everywhere to preach the gospel and then painfully give his life on a cross just so he could turn his back on us and spend the next few thousand years pretending to be a myth. He'd act like he believed what the gospel said about him. He'd even go to church like he wants everybody else to do, and we'd all see him there. And that would prevent Christianity from being dismissed as a mere superstition. And it wouldn't take no cultural conditioning to predispose folks to notice it. Instead of God being irrelevant to modern culture would be irrelevant to God. But that ain't what Dr. Craig's got. He's got a supposed deity whose modern-day behavior is indistinguishable from a myth. and it's up to apologists like Dr. Craig to try and make up the difference with arguments and cultural conditioning. I think he's a bit over-optimistic about the eventual fruits of the seeds he's sowing. Quote, if Christians could be trained to provide solid evidence for what they believe and good answers to unbelievers' questions and objections, then the perception of Christians would slowly change. Christians would be seen as thoughtful people to be taken seriously rather than as emotional fanatics or buffoons. End quote. Dr. Craig is forgetting the Bible verse that says, by their fruits you shall know them. Christians can talk all the pretty words and make all the superficially plausible arguments they want, but at the end of the day, folks is going to judge Christians by how they behave. Talk up Jesus all you want, but if he ain't producing a noticeable improvement in your behavior, he's going to come across as irrelevant, and you're going to come across as somebody whose religion don't deserve to be taken seriously. Apologetics ain't going to help with how folks perceive Christians when the media is full of Christians promoting bullying of children who happen to be trans and calling teachers quote-unquote groomers just because they try to prevent the bullying and to provide a supportive environment for their students. Apologetics ain't going to help when we see Christians getting vocally active in supporting openly fascist political candidates and electing billionaire oligarchs to positions of political power. Dr. Craig can do all the preaching he wants, but in the end, the actions of Christians is going to do more to discredit his apologetics than any intellectual opposition by skeptics. I fully expect that by the time this political mess is all over, America's going to be even more post-Christian than Western Europe. And the only sad part is how much we's all going to have to endure to get from here to there. But back in 2010, Dr. Craig ain't got any insights into how his culture wars is going to backfire on him. He has this naive optimism that if folks just learns how to argue like he does, everything's going to be hunky-dory and life in America's going to be like being a kid at vacation Bible school again. And no God's going to spoil his fantasy by telling him the truth. And I suppose there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to start with Dr. Craig telling us what the second reason is for why apologetics is important. And spoiler alert, saving souls ain't going to come in second place neither. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.